Well, hello again, everybody. Dorothy called me and asked me the title of the sermon, and she caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure, and said, choose your fear. And then, that's pretty ominous, isn't it? Don't worry, I mean it literally. When I was a kid in grade school, living in Mexico, my brother John and I lived in this neighborhood, and we had these 4 friends that we used to hang out with all the time. And we had a lot of fun. We were just always out in the street playing. And it was a great time. But there was a bizarre tradition in the group that existed before we moved to the neighborhood. And you see, on any given day, one of the members of the group might be singled out and would be ceremoniously severed from the group. And so you would be cast aside, and ostracized, and apart from the emotional distress and the humiliation that might bring, there was also the understanding that if that individual was seen on the street, there'd be a pounding. And so this is, I don't know, kids, things that we do. Well, one day coming back home from school, I found myself the subject of one of these sentences. I didn't understand it, but it was just one of those things. And so I made it to the house, and I thought, well, this really stinks. Now I can't go outside. I thought, that's okay. I'll just play in the backyard for the next couple of days. It'll all blow over, and then we'll all go back to normal. And so that evening, we were getting ready for supper, and as was our custom, in Mexico, you have to go to the store just about for every meal. You have to go get something. And so we were getting ready for supper, and Dad said, Steve, go to the store around the corner and get us some sodas. And so I was thinking about it, and I thought, okay, to go to the store, I'm going to have to get out through the iron gate, which makes a strange sound that you can hear from 2 blocks away. 2 of the boys lived directly across the house from ours. The other 2 boys lived up the hill on the way to the store. And I thought, oh, great. So I said, Dad, I can't go to the store. You need to send John. I've got this problem with the boys, and I just can't go outside. And so I don't remember exactly how he responded, but it was something along the lines of course, it was a Spanish version of, boy, if you don't go to the store right now, you can have a problem with me. And so, I had this tough choice to make, Which fear was greater? The fear of running into the boys on the street or the fear of Dad? And I thought about this long and hard for about 2 seconds. Then I went to my room, I got my best running shoes on, and I headed for the store. Because after I saw it from Dad's perspective, I just wasn't afraid of the boys anymore. Sometimes we have to choose between different things. We face fears, and sometimes those fears are offset by other fears. And unfortunately, fear gets a bad rap. We have a poor understanding of fear. There's a song that says, fear is a friend that you misunderstood. And I think that's probably right. I think we misunderstand fear a lot. In today's world, fear is just considered to be objectively a bad thing. It's just bad. Fear is never good. Fear is always a sign of bad things. Not bad things to come, it's bad things in the present. If you're afraid of something, basically fear is just like a vestige of our primitive selves. It's an old form of a security system that we used to have, and it's become obsolete now because of enlightenment and because of science, and there's just no need for fear anymore. Sometimes our disagreements are blamed on fear. If you disagree with a certain worldview, if you disagree with a lifestyle, if you disagree with a certain ideology, it's blamed on fear. You're just afraid. You're just afraid of the way the world is changing now. You're just afraid of different ways of thinking. And so today, when you disagree with the mainstream thought, society will often give you a diagnosis. You have a phobia. You're a thisophobe or you're thatophobic. And you're just afraid. And it's because we misunderstand fear. The reality of it is, fear is a basic element of our human makeup. We've always had it. And it's there by design, is the interesting thing. It's been there from the very beginning, even in the Garden of Eden. When God told Adam and Eve, you can eat from any tree in the garden. Just don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was a commandment. But he followed it up, saying, if you do eat, that day you will surely die. And it's interesting that he added that detail to the commandment. It was the knowledge that something bad, even though they didn't quite understand what death was, they knew that it was something bad. They didn't want to go through that, and that's why that gave them an incentive to make sure that they stayed away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In fact, after they tasted the fruit, and they were hiding because they heard the voice of God in the garden, Adam admitted they were hiding because they were afraid. Now, where did this fear come from? Because it had nothing to do with the tree. The tree was about knowledge of good and evil. The consequences of tasting the fruit of the tree was death, not fear. But the fear was already in Adam. In fact, when the serpent was tempting Eve to eat of the fruit, he questioned Eve's understanding of the consequences. So did God really say you would die? She said, yeah, of course. And it's interesting that the serpent didn't dare her to eat the fruit. The serpent didn't say, come on, Eve, live a little. Do something dangerous. Do something that can cause your death. He didn't say, take a walk on the wild side. Instead, what he did was he deceived her into thinking that what she feared wasn't worth her fear. He made her believe that there was nothing dangerous at all about eating the fruit. Bottom line is the story of the fall could be viewed as a story of two fears. The fear of death, the fear of God, and we often confront conflicting fears. And Jesus addressed this with his disciples. He understood that we deal with fear on a daily basis. And so, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus is going to teach his disciples something about fear. But first we need to understand why he needs to teach them a lesson about fear. See, leading up to that little lesson that he's going to give them, there's been something going on. Jesus has been dealing with a large crowd of people, and he's been dealing basically with two things: contrast and antagonism. Contrast and antagonism. Contrast because, for example, he was casting out demons, and so some of the Pharisees were saying, well, he only does that because he's doing it with the power of Beelzebul. That's how he does it. And Jesus comes back and explains to them, guys, it's not possible. A house divided cannot stand. So if I'm casting out demons, it must be because I'm doing it because I come from the Father. Because there is a clear line between Beelzebul and the Father. And there is a division between the two of us. There is a big difference between the demons and myself. There's a difference between the powers of Beelzebul and the powers of the Father. Later on, Jesus gives this parable about when you light up a lamp, you don't cover it up with a basket. You put it up on a high place so that it lights the whole house. And he's talking about the contrast of light and darkness. And there is a division. There is a clear line and difference between the light and the darkness. But he also talks about antagonism. Because there is an inevitable enmity between the light and the darkness. More specifically, there's an enmity between those who are in the light and those who are in the darkness. We've all been in the darkness at one point. But here's the deal about those that are in the darkness. A lot of them are there because they haven't seen the light. But others are in the darkness because they've seen the light and they don't like it. And so there is always antagonism between those who live in the light and those who live in the darkness. But there are these lines of division. And these lines of division between the light and the dark run in all different directions. And they run at all different latitudes. In this particular case, Jesus had taken on the Pharisees because somebody invited him to a meal, and Jesus sat down to eat, and he hadn't washed his hands. And that caused a big stink. Because the Pharisees saw Jesus sit down and start eating without washing his hands, and they started to have this attitude of, hey, that's not cool. You know, we have standards around here. We don't do that sort of thing. You know, this is what we believe is a proper way to conduct yourself in society. We believe in washing your hands. That's a big deal for us. You need to wash your hands, Jesus. And so Jesus calls them out on it. He says, you guys really worry about cleaning the outside of the vessels, but on the inside, you're just rotten. And then, of course, the scribes lock ranks with the Pharisees, and they say, hey, Jesus, when you say that to them, you're insulting us too. And Jesus says, well, then, if the shoe fits. And so they had this confrontation, and after the confrontation, Jesus walks off, and his disciples follow him. And so there's this big crowd of his disciples. And then he addresses them. And this is what he says. Luke 12, verses 4 and 5. He says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. One of the things that strikes me about the way Jesus begins this discourse is he says, let me tell you something, friends. He's addressing his friends. He's not talking to just a big crowd of people. He's addressing his friends. And Jesus knows who his friends are. There's a big difference between the people that will follow Jesus after feeding thousands of people or healing the blind and healing the lame and casting out demons. There's a big difference between the people that will follow him after that and those that will follow Jesus after taking on the Pharisees and the scribes. You see, and choices were made. When he had this confrontation with the authorities of the day, the religious authorities, choices were made by those who witnessed it. You can imagine people watching this thing going on, and you have the Pharisees yelling something at Jesus, and Jesus kind of responding something back to them, and then Jesus walks that way, and the Pharisees walk that way in anger, and then you got these other two guys just kind of looking at what's going on, and then you got one guy says, you know what, Bill, I think Jesus is right. I think we ought to follow him. The other one says, I don't know, Fred, I really don't want to get on the bad side of those Pharisees. You know, they can keep you out of the synagogue. They'll kick you out. They won't let you go into the temple, and then what are we going to do? There was pressure. There definitely was pressure. And it's hard for us to appreciate that sometimes because we have different ways of creating community. We have our sports leagues or we have our school that we go to, and we have different ways of creating community. But for a first century Jew, the synagogue was the lifeblood of the community. You have to be part of it. And if you angered the authorities and you got kicked out of the synagogue, it wasn't just that you couldn't be in the synagogue. That stigma followed you everywhere you went. There was a high price to pay for getting on the bad side of the religious authorities. Nevertheless, there's a difference between those that hear Jesus and those that follow Jesus. And the ones that believed him followed him, and they heard the rest of his discourse. And when Jesus is talking to his disciples, to his friends, he says, don't fear those that can kill the body, but after that have nothing else that they can do. And when I read that, I go, well, killing the body is a pretty big deal. I am kind of afraid of people that can kill the body. But Jesus recognizes, there are risks. There are real threats against those who follow Jesus. There are real threats that come from those who oppose Jesus. And it's not necessarily always death, but it's up to death. There are a wide range of threats that those who follow Jesus will face from those who live in the darkness. At worst, they might kill you, but there are a lot of other things that they can do also that, by the way, cause us fear. Because that dividing line between the light and the dark runs in all different directions. Sometimes that dividing line runs right down your street, dividing you from your neighbors. Sometimes that line runs right down the corridors of your office, dividing you from your coworkers. Sometimes that dividing line runs right between you and your college professors. In fact, there are times when that line runs right down the middle of your family's dinner table. And there are real threats that come from that. There are real causes for fear about what will happen if we choose to follow Jesus in that moment. I remember in our youth group back in Juarez, there was a young man in the neighborhood that, it was just, neighborhood troublemaker. And he was into drugs and all that. But a friend brought him to church. And he started coming to church, and the gospel appealed to him. And he accepted Christ, and he started to change his life. His name was Daniel. But his mother didn't really like him going to church. And after a while, we noticed that Daniel wasn't showing up for church anymore. And after a couple of weeks of him not showing up, as a youth group, we decided we'd go and pay him a visit and see what was going on. So we went over to his house. And we called on him, but he didn't come out. His mom came out. And we said, well, we're looking for Daniel. He hasn't been to church, and we're just wondering why. What's the deal? If he's okay? And she said, no, he's fine. He hasn't been going to church because I don't like him going to church. Well, but why wouldn't you want him to go to church? He said, look, kids, I'd rather see my son dead than in a Protestant church. And we were just shocked. The sad thing is, that's really what happened. A few years later, he returned to a life of drug use and crime. He wound up in prison, and that's where he was murdered. The fear of what might happen if we continue to follow Jesus despite the threats that we receive from other human beings is hard to overcome. It's a real fear. But Jesus warns no less than twice. He says, I will tell you who to fear. Fear the one who, after he kills, has the power to throw into hell. Yes, fear him. In other words, no, really, fear him. And when Jesus says fear, he means fear. And this is hard for us to take because we've grown up in this idea that fear is just a bad thing. And so when Jesus says fear God, really fear him because he can not just kill the body, but he can throw into hell. That just really rubs us the wrong way. We think, oh, surely he means fear as in reverence. Well, the word he used for fear of God is the same word he used for fear of men. It's the exact same word. In fact, it's the exact same word that we see throughout the New Testament. It's the word that's the root for our English word phobia, which means terror. There's a word for reverence in the Greek. And we see it in the New Testament a total of 2 times in the book of Hebrews. Jesus is not talking about reverence. He's talking about fear. Real, honest to goodness fear. And that's so difficult for us to handle because we just don't like the idea of fear. But it's very interesting that, well, there's this part in C.S. Lewis, the book, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. in the Chronicles of Narnia, there's this really interesting part in the book where these kids who've gone through this wardrobe and they're in this new world, and these kids find themselves in the house of Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And Mrs. Beaver is going on and on about Aslan, and they're about to meet Aslan. And Aslan is this powerful figure, and he's the king. And he's just a powerful, awesome individual. And the kids are starting to get excited about meeting him because they're about to meet him. And somehow it slips that Aslan is actually a lion. And so Susan is kind of startled by that. I thought he was a man. And Mrs. Beaver says, no, he's a lion. And so Susan says, well, I really thought he was a man. I'd be pretty nervous about meeting a lion. Be kind of scared. And so she says, yeah, you'd be scared, and you'd be right to be scared. And then Susan asks, well, but is he safe? And then Mr. Beaver cuts in and he says, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he's not safe. But he's good. And that makes all the difference in the world. God is the greatest threat. He is also the greatest security. In him is the ultimate safety. If you fear God, you have nothing else to fear. And it's very important to understand what this means exactly, because what the Bible tells us is that God is good. God is good, which is the positive power that operates in opposition to evil. Very different from being benign. Benign is harmless. It's not good. It's harmless. When you buy a mousetrap, you don't buy a benign mousetrap. You buy a good mousetrap. When you're going to take a cancer drug, you don't take a benign cancer drug. You take a good cancer drug. Because a good drug can tell the difference between the cancer and your body, and it kills the cancer, and it saves your body. That's what good is. It fights its counterpart. It's a force in opposition to its counterpart. God's goodness is like a perfectly true rudder that directs God's amazing power through human history, lifting up to salvation all the souls that trust in him, and executing his judgment on those who fear him not. That is God's goodness. But what does that mean for us? How should we live out differently if we understand that we are to fear God and not fear men? Well, if you'll bear with me for just a few more minutes, I'd like to answer that in two ways. First, in an abstract sense, and then lastly, in a more practical way. In the abstract, we are to see ourselves as lights in a world of darkness. We are light. That's what Jesus said. We are light in the middle of a world of darkness. And as we move in this world, we will hear voices from the dark commanding us to cover up that light, to put a basket over the light. This is the old keep your faith to yourself. That might be your truth, but it isn't my truth. Well, there's no such thing as your truth and my truth. There's one truth, and we all have to share it. And so when we hear those voices telling us to cover up that light, we must reject those demands. In a more practical sense, if you model Jesus in conviction, in word, and in deed, you will create a contrast between yourself and the darkness. And when that happens, you will inevitably draw out the antagonism that comes with it. You will, without a doubt, draw some antagonism. And when that happens, when we fear the threat that comes from those who are in the dark, there are three things that we need to constantly be remembering. Number one is that this was foreseen. Later on in that same chapter, Jesus would say, "Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For from now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. We already know. We already know. So, first of all, this was foreseen. Secondly, you're playing the long game. We who have believed in Jesus are playing the long game. And see, there are those who believe that life ends at the grave. That's only halftime. You might even say it's the end of the first quarter. It is by no means the end of the game. And we are playing the long game, and we know that the victory has been secured, and that's what we are waiting on. In verses 8 and 9, Jesus tells his disciples, "And I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man also will acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God." So just remember that we are playing the long game. And third, and most importantly, when we're told to cover up that light and to keep the light to ourselves under whatever threat we might be facing at the time, because we do acknowledge that we live in a time when people get fired for upholding biblical values. CEOs have been fired because of it. Businesses are boycotted because of it. Essays get Fs because of it, amazingly. There are all sorts of consequences. And that does bring some fear. But understand this. You just might be the light someone has been longing to see. Because again, there are many of those who are in the dark because they've just never seen the light. One of the things that amazes me is that every time Jesus got into a spat with the authorities, people followed him, knowing full well what that meant. Knowing perfectly that they might not be welcome in the synagogue anymore. Knowing that that might cause trouble at home. But when you see the light, everything becomes clear. And so they follow Jesus. And so you choose today. You choose today whom you will fear, God or man. Let's pray.